A few years ago, after about a decade of being away from all things spiritual, I had an experience with John's gospel that I'm still sitting with. I'd left a monastery, left any form of religious practice. I continued half-hearted attempts at contemplative sitting, and I was reading Zen koans a lot, but that was the extent of my practice. For me, Zen koans collapsed all the question words koans had to a here and now situation. When was always now. What was always this. Where was always here. Who was always me. Why and how were a little different. Why seemed like a non-question, and how always was by doing what you're doing. To this day, I don't know my general way of sitting with koans to be kosher according to any Rinzai Zen teacher, but that too is and was a non-question. In the monastery, I'd been taught the method of Lectio Divina, a way of reading scripture using your reaction to biblical text to read the deepest emotions and intentions of your heart. It struck me that koans were a bit different. They were using illogical verbal formulations to force quit mental work. What is the sound of one hand clapping is a classic example. Everybody does that, which is a use of humor to get around the question, but one hand can't clap. There is an answer to one hand clapping, but it exists on the other side of a general stoppage of mental work. It occurred to me that there were a lot of things like that in Scripture. Christianity had a way of explaining them as mysteriously meaningful, but I was beginning to think that in addition to all that, the Gospel's seemingly contradictory passages had a function to slow down or stop the brain entirely. So I decided to reapproach the Gospels, but to read them as if they were a koan. So one day at a coffee shop, at great risk of appearing way too pious, I sat down with a large coffee and opened to John's Gospel for the first time in about a decade. And what I read there totally changed my life right from the start. John's Gospel begins, "In the beginning was the Word." Almost immediately, the question, when is the beginning, reared its head. And something in me knew the answer is right here, right now. As I continued reading John's Gospel, the roots of this new kind of reading sunk in. I was letting the question words force quit all the parts of my brain that were far too accustomed to mental overwork. What I'm warming up to is this. I want to do a close reading of John's Gospel as if it's a koan. I'll give one example of why I think this kind of reading is fruitful. All over John's Gospel, there are signs that people have poked through the illogicality of language. Of Christ, John the Baptist says, "After me comes one who is ahead of me because he is before me." Well, John was definitely born before Jesus. There's no sense in which Jesus came before John. I think that struggling with who Jesus was broke John's brain. I think he realized that Jesus is the embodiment of a paradox that renders chronological time imminent. In other words, encounters with Jesus made linear time collapse into the here and now. In the beginning was the Logos, says the original Greek in the Gospel. I paid half-hearted attention during my theological studies in college, and I know that logos was defined as the ordering principle of the universe. Well, now, for me, logos was becoming something more like the Chinese character mu, M-U. Mu is a verbal cue to struggle with the illogicality until contradiction, where two opposite truths can't coexist, becomes paradox. In other words, when two opposite truths can coexist because the egos of those beholding the truth have taken a backseat to humility. So over the next few months, I want to just close read John's gospel with you. I have a feeling that a lot of the dualism baked into the Western European mindset will be strongly challenged for you, just as it has been for me. I hope y'all are well. This is going to be fun. Peace be with you. And there's a great deal more to come, I promise.